You are listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and/or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season will be set in Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. In this episode, we are using the format of a radio play where a voice actor stands in for Pat Brassington to perform Pat's answers to my questions. Pat Brassington is one of Australia's most significant and influential artists. In a career that spans 4 decades, she has become recognised for her incisive ability to infuse the familiar with the fantastic, to create enigmatic and ambitious photomontages that capture the emotional force of memory. Her practice is informed by an interest in surrealism, feminism and psychoanalysis. Pat's work has featured extensively in national and international solo and group exhibitions, and her work is held in all major Australian state, regional, university and private collections. In 2018, she was the recipient of a Creative Australia for Visual Arts Award in recognition of the achievements of an artist who has made an outstanding and sustained contribution to Australian art. In this conversation, Pat and I talk about growing up in Hobart, the inspiration for her work, feminism, and what is on her mind when she's making her images. Pat Brassington is represented by Arc1 Gallery Melbourne and Bet Gallery Hobart. You can see Pat's work on our Instagram page at artdestinations.podcast. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. Hi Pat, thanks for coming on to Art Destinations Tasmania. It's really great to have you here.
Hi Sarah, thank you for having me.
So how did you spend your time as a child in Hobart?
Some of my fondest memories have strong connections to the natural environment. At any given time, like exploring the Queen's Domain with my brother, we would catch tadpoles, chase grasshoppers, sledge precariously down dry grassy slopes in summer on shonky billy carts and dare each other not to go home, but we always did. Entertaining myself happily in a Newtown backyard that never seemed to end. But of course, it was only an average-sized suburban backyard bounded by paling fences. Being invited to play at other children's homes was always a thrill. Compared to mine, they were like castles. I also loved reading, anything I could lay my hands on. I was a daydreamer.
So at what point did you become aware that you were living on an island when you were growing up?
I'm really not sure, but probably during rudimentary geography classes in primary school. In retrospect, I imagined I inhabited many islands. Around the age of 6, one island was a room in my home at the time, 4 walls, a closed door and a small window with a view onto a wood paling fence. And my bed was a boat that often rocked when I was feverish. I had contracted a poliomyelitis type virus, so I had to remain in isolation for 6 weeks. The only person I saw was my mother and a doctor who would occasionally call by. Another memorable island was a big patch of hilly bush straddling the outskirts of the suburbs of Warrane and Howrah, but now submerged by the suburb of Mornington. It was a place I frequented as a teenager when I needed some respite from family life.
Oh, that must have been a really hard period. I'm really interested in the parallel between the geographic self and the psychological self. I'm interested in how living on an island shapes our imagination. And through that isolation, there's a deep connection to place. And I'm just wondering, when you were a child or teenager, at what point did you become aware that you were living on an island when you were growing up?
I'm really not sure, but probably during rudimentary geography classes in primary school. In retrospect, I imagined I inhabited many islands. Around the age of 6, one island was a room in my home at the time. 4 walls, a closed door and a small window with a view onto a wood paling fence. And my bed was a boat that often rocked when I was feverish. I had contracted a poliomyelitis type virus, so I had to remain in isolation for 6 weeks. The only person I saw was my mother and a doctor who would occasionally call by. Another memorable island was a big patch of hilly bush straddling the outskirts of the suburbs of Warrane and Howrah, but now submerged by the suburb of Mornington. It was a place I frequented as a teenager when I needed some respite from family life.
So your work is not about Tasmania in any way, but do you feel a sense of being an island in yourself?
I do feel a deep connection to Tasmania. It's where I was born and will die. It's the place where I grew up, where I was educated, where I fell in love, where I gave birth to my daughters. It's the place that brings a lump to my throat and tears to my eyes when arriving back home after overseas and interstate trips. I'm not refuting no man is an island, but I would propose that it's important to recognise and respect a person's need for personal space.
That's beautiful. So your work in all its fragmented views feels as though it's part of a broader conversation about something important, yet we're never quite sure what it is. This is reflective of life, how we live our life. It unfolds before us. And we experience fragments and we're never sure how our actions will impact others. What are some of the ideas you're inviting us to consider?
On and off over the years, I've been trying to get my head around the concept of dialectics in an effort to come to terms with the contradictory nature of things. What I mean here is, can opposites coexist and both be true? Or is some intervention or integration necessary? I think that some of my works hint at this conundrum. I have chosen to represent my point of view or way of seeing things via visual art, where the outcome of my ideas manifest themselves as images to be hung on a gallery wall or reproduced in magazines, journals, etc. When my work came to the attention of the art world, some people on meeting me for the first time couldn't hide their surprise. I mean, they had assumed I was much younger.
That's such a compliment. You must be really chuffed with that. That's really lovely. So what's your main form of inspiration? Are you reading novels, newspapers, listening to music, watching film? Where does Pat Brassington find her inspiration?
My overriding source of inspiration is human nature, or more succinctly, the human condition as it unfolds for better or worse, warts and all. And the drive to try and make sense of it all runs in tandem with my keen interest in the evolution of the history of ideas. It's inevitable, I guess, that I am an avid reader of fiction and non-fiction, and I try to stay abreast with current affairs, either via the print media, radio or TV. I love being immersed in a good movie, and listening to music is a must too.
So you must be borrowing a lot of ideas from all these places, and your work is using collage from both your own collection of images and those of others. Do you always have a camera close at hand? Are you making pictures for your archive to use as a reference at any time? or are you being more specific and focused when you're making your work?
I do have an SLR camera at the ready, but it's rarely used now. An iPhone, yes, of course. I am prone to selecting images from my 35mm black and white negatives to scan, interfere with, select elements from, and then recycle. Some images have a long pedigree. I could say each work has a different starting point and is the outcome of its own journey.
Okay. So are you inspired by your archive, or do you have stories you want to tell that are already forming in your mind, and then you look for pictures to tell those stories?
A bit of both, I think.
Okay. So how important is the image title in making the work?
I do tag images with nicknames when I'm working on them, and they are generally spontaneous responses from me, but I mostly discard them. Well, maybe because they are too direct, too literal, too crass. I do place importance on titling works and consider them carefully, but beware, some titles are deliberately ironic.
And so to what extent is the whole series important in reading one work, or does that work stand alone?
I'm not sure what you mean by series here, Sarah. I have produced series of works. For example, A Perfect Day, the atmospherics of which for me were to be suggestive of the same cataclysmic event, like a nuclear disaster. And Cambridge Road, a series of 18 works where I tried to capture the feeling of being ghosted by a house with its unwelcoming memories and associations etched deep. Often singular images from a series can and do live their lives independently from each other. At other times, I feel a series is somewhat diminished, if not acknowledged as an entity unto itself.
Which artists inspired your early work?
I'll interpret early work as being images produced between 1982, 86 thereabouts, or those almost devoid of any interference apart from the occasional and larger manipulation. In other words, darkroom processed photographs developed from my own negatives. So I would suggest Diane Arbus, Carol Jerems, Ian Dodd, Robert Mapplethorpe, amongst many others. Post-1986, early 90s, my sphere of influence broadened out considerably to include the practice of artists like Christian Boltanski and Annette Messager.
As your work evolves, are you responding to the current events that are happening in the time, watching the news, or are you responding more emotionally as an individual in the world? I ask this in reference to the rise of the feminist, #MeToo movement. Did you want to tap into the emotions that those stories are triggering, or are you responding to more universal stories that have always unfolded through time?
I am a feminist, but I can't say that I wholeheartedly embrace the Me Too movement. I would say in the main my point of view as an individual in regards to socio-political events is informed by personal experiences and what I have learned from them and what I've learned from others' stories and experiences.
So what emotional responses are you looking for through your work?
I assume you mean a viewer's response here, and that I can't second guess.
Okay. So what's the significance of using a pink colour palette, often against black and white or cream? You've got this very kind of monochromatic colour palette, but there's always a pink, often a pink introduced.
To emphasise an important element in an image. I have said this many times. I don't calculate or genderise colour. I feel it. It's not a pretty pink I seek. It's a meaty pinkishness I'm after, like the colour of the fluid that runs through our veins.
So in doing a bit of research for this conversation, I read that the negative traits associated with pale pink are timidity, neediness, naivety, disarming or non-threatening, lacking strength, childishness, and suffocating, which are all quite negative connotations, really. And for example, you are quoted as saying, "It's not my intention to feminize the image by using pink. It's nastier than that. Pink smothers." In Ashley Crawford's essay, Pat Brassington's Totems and Taboos, in the Australian Art Collector. So prisons and mental hospitals are using pink as a pacifier. But if people are saying it's suffocating, can pink be both?
Yes.
The little girls are conditioned to love pink. What impact does this have psychologically, do you think? And does this come through in your work?
No.
Okay, so how overtly are you exploring feminism in your work?
My practice since the 1980s has been underpinned by developments in feminism, and in particular feminist deconstruction of dominant masculine codes in Western art. I identify as female and I embrace feminism, but do I politicise this in my work? I don't think so. Well, not in a polemical sense.
Okay, so distortion is a common theme in your work. And so what does distortion signify?
I will distort if I need to resolve formal qualities in any given image. And frankly, I won't sign off on an image unless I am satisfied I have done my best. Once the image is in the public arena, signification is up for grabs and out of my control. I do tease myself sometimes with the thought I may be a kind of neo-mannerist.
That's lovely. So to what extent do you balance straight photography with photomontages? Because I notice that you're exploring with both. You're playing with both. And how are you finding the balance?
I don't really think I want to find a balance. I mean, yes, I employ photomontage techniques regularly and will sometimes endeavour to achieve a seamless quality like a straight photograph implies. But I will also leave well alone and not interfere. It depends really on what aesthetic look I am chasing.
So while your work is lens-based, how important is the medium of photography to you? What are your thoughts on the expanded photographic practice and the shift away from photography as we know it?
Since the advent of the age of mechanical reproduction, the expanded photographic practices have accelerated exponentially. Well, I've tried to discourage being pigeonholed as a photographer per se, not out of disrespect at all, but I define myself as an artist. I like this Anish Kapoor quote. A lot of my works are about passage, about a passing through, and that necessitates a place.
That's a really lovely way to end. Thank you so much, Pat Brassington, for coming along.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Art Destinations. Be reminded about our next episode by subscribing to our fortnightly newsletter on our website artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.